Hello, everyone. Kia ora, bulavanaka, talofa lava, bonjour, hello, kia orana, hello oketa, and a very warm welcome to this Business Link Pacific webinar, Resilience Through Cooperation Part 2. Thank you so much for joining us today from wherever you are in the world. Before we get started, I just want to make a couple of introductions and share some important information with you. So for the duration of the webinar, please keep your microphone and camera on mute if possible. This just helps us get a really clear feed of our presenter and his presentation slides. We'll have one Q&A session today, and there's always opportunities for feedback. So if there's any questions you have during the webinar, please do pop them in the chat box, which you can find on the top right-hand corner of your screen. And you can do this throughout the webinar. If we do run out of time for questions, or if you think of anything after the webinar, you are welcome to email me at media@businesslinkpacific.com, and you'll have we'll be able to email you privately with an answer after the webinar. We'll also be sending out a recording of the full webinar later today, and it will be available on our website in case there's anybody in your networks who you think would benefit from today's presentation. So for most of you, I think most of you who are already in the BLP network, you probably know quite a bit about us, but for those of you who don't, I'm going to give you a really quick refresher of what BLP is all about. So we are a New Zealand government-funded private sector development initiative delivered by DT Global. We currently work in 6 countries: Samoa, Fiji, Vanuatu, Papua New Guinea, and more recently, the Solomon Islands and the Cook Islands. We work in partnership with the Chambers of Commerce, financial institutions, and the private sector to develop a business advisory service provider network in the Pacific region that improves access of business services to growing SMEs. Now, we do this by offering 3 main services. We have a free online business health check, which helps businesses identify where there might be gaps that could benefit from business advice. We also have just released an online business continuity planner, another free business tool similar to the health check, which focuses on business continuity planning. We have a searchable database of over 90 BLP quality approved business advisors, and all of our advisors go through a quality assurance process to ensure they are reliable and qualified. We offer the BLP subsidy scheme, which helps growing businesses gain access to quality business advice and support at a subsidized rate from our business advisors. Since 2018, we have supported Pacific Island businesses in many ways. We've connected over 500 growing businesses with BLP approved advisors and completed 555 subsidy projects, which at the beginning of this year, we subsidized the full cost of due to the COVID-19 crisis. 1,610 business health checks and continuity planners have been completed, as well as 164 business diagnostics. For more information, you can find more information on our website, www.businesslinkpacific.com. Our presenter today is Kevin Fort. He's the founder, executive director, and chief operations officer of Regenerative Business Institute, currently based in Arizona, USA. He presented a great webinar about 2 weeks ago on the same topic, resilience through cooperation, and today he's here to present part 2. Kevin holds a bachelor's degree in accounting and a master's degree in business administration. He has nearly 20 years of finance, accounting, and business development experience and has spent the last 6 years studying cooperative and ESOP business structures. At RBI, he leads the Institute's cooperative development initiatives, and RBI are now a BLP quality approved business advisor in our network, currently in the process of relocating to Vanuatu. So like I said, Kevin's here to present part 2 of a 2-part webinar on the topic of resilience through cooperation, where part 1 focused on the what it takes to build resilient businesses and economies. Part 2 will focus on the how cooperative business leaders can build resilience into their business model and enhance member participation. Kevin, welcome.
Thank you. Good evening. Okay, are you able to see the slideshow?
Yep, it's all good.
Good evening. Thanks for having me back. I'm looking forward to discussing tonight's topic as we transition from the what how cooperatives can lead to more regenerative economies into the specifics of how. To get us started tonight, I kind of wanted to begin the conversation and really kind of pull down to the nuts and bolts of what it is that we're talking about. I find that oftentimes when we're working with our clients, they might need a little clarity as to why cooperation or employee ownership is one of the main drivers to resilience within any economy, whether that's in the micro or macro basis. And so to simplify the terms, whether you're in the fishing industry, whether you're in agribusiness or tourism and hospitality, what we find with most conventionally structured businesses is that they're often competing for a shrinking slice of whatever industry pie that business might be in. So for example, if I was to own a restaurant and I was a sole proprietor or maybe even an LLC or corporation, but I owned a restaurant, what I'm going to find is that my restaurant is competing within my local economy for a ever shrinking slice of a pie. And the reason that cooperation comes to the table as a form of resilience, particularly when we're looking at developing local economies, is because through cooperation, the focus tends to shift from trying to individually go after my small slice of that pie or increase that slice of the pie that I have, into growing the pie in total, meaning that cooperatively, the other businesses that are within my industry, the focus becomes how do we capture a greater share of the industry together and keep those resources local. So with that, tonight's agenda, I'd like to go over an era of subscription-based businesses. And I want to talk about this specifically because I think the trend is telling when it comes to what consumers are really looking for. From there, I'd like to go into building resilience into the business model. And for those of you who have been to the website, you have probably found that I'm affectionately referred to as the finance is fun guy. And none of my presentations would be complete without a conversation around the topic of finance. And I'm hoping that through tonight's conversation, I'll be able to help illustrate how the financials translate into that resilience, and specifically how cooperative-based financials relate to that resilience. One of the most important parts of any business, obviously, is participation from the employees, or from the consumers and the employees. And with co-ops and employee-owned businesses, it's no different. So we're going to look at ways to enhance member participation. From there, I thought it might be relevant to briefly go over some of the steps that are necessary to starting a co-op for those who are interested in what it might look like and what work is involved. Or for those who currently have a business and maybe questioning what would it take to transition from a conventionally structured business into a co-op or an employee owner structure. We'll highlight a few of those key points there. And then at the very end, obviously the topic with me for resilience is always continuing education all the way up and down throughout the organization, but particularly within the leadership ranks, as the leadership is necessary to foster and grow the organization and all the individuals who participate in the organization. So an era of subscription-based businesses, what we've seen within the business community globally is that e-commerce has grown, and particularly subscription-based e-commerce has grown over 100% since 2013. And what this tells us is that consumers are trading product for brand ownership, meaning that consumers want to identify with the brand more than they want to identify with the products that they're purchasing. However, a key interesting statistic when we break down consumer trends is if we go back and we look at the Net Promoter Score. The Net Promoter Score is a way that businesses can go in and look at what does consumer confidence look like. And so the trend actually shows, even though there's an increasing trend into e-commerce subscription, that consumer satisfaction within that space is decreasing over time. And what that tells me in the space that I consult with is that consumers are absolutely looking to identify with their brand. They want to take ownership in the brands that they choose to participate in. But the brands right now, because of the conventional structure, struggle to meet the consumer's true expectations and needs. And that's something that we're going to go over a little bit further tonight. But I did want to point out that within this, the Net Promoter Score is definitely an indication that there are things that are lacking and missing within the business space, and these are opportunities for the savvy business and particularly the savvy co-op to get involved and actually gain some traction in the market. So an area of subscription-based businesses, My Food Bag is a company that I'm familiar with out of New Zealand. They do home-based grocery delivery, and oftentimes they started out within the prepared meal space and have since moved into other areas such as nutritional advising and those types of areas. Companies are shifting their focus. They understand that consumers are wanting more brand loyalty over product loyalty, and so they're kind of shifting their advertising to suit those needs. And also, they're also looking to capture more of the consumer spend, and there's a very specific reason for that. If we look at My Food Bag when they first started, their initial business plan probably really targeted and focused the dining out spend. So there was probably a portion that they looked at and said, are we really competing for what the household would usually spend on grocery at the grocery store, or are we really competing for what they would spend at a restaurant? And given the fact that they started with mostly prepared meals, the argument I think would stand that the company initially started with the focus of we're competing for discretionary or dining out income. And over time, they came to realize that what we really are going to have to start targeting and pursuing is more of a holistic approach to the category, meaning that we're going to have to not only focus on the dining out spend in the household budget, but we're also going to have to start targeting more of the total food spend for that household. And they're looking at that whole necessity, that whole category of households need food, families need consumption, or a consumption of food for nutrition reasons. And so the business model takes a shift and starts to focus on capturing a larger portion of that budget. So moving into how does that translate into the building of the resilience into the business model? Within the financial statements, one of the first statements, and I find that most business owners are very familiar with their profit and loss statement or their income statement. This is a favorite statement. It's pretty easy to decipher what this financial statement is trying to tell us. But in the interest of tonight's topic, I thought we'd break it down and dive a little bit deeper into what truly this statement and other statements that are used within the business world are actually telling us about the resilience of the company. Most clients that I work with are pretty familiar with the top of the statement representing the revenue streams that are applicable to the company. And then somewhere below the revenue line, there will be structured the cost structure of the business. Some businesses will structure their direct cost, or what's also called their cost of goods sold, meaning the direct material and direct labor that's necessary to produce their revenue. And then from there, they're able to attain their gross profit. Once that's attained, then from there, we subtract out any of the indirect variable and fixed costs, also known as our overhead costs, to come back to a total picture of the net profit, or how well the company did from the bottom line perspective. What I've done here is I've kind of highlighted the two sections of this financial statement because they tell a story. And for the savvy business owner who's really paying attention to the story that this statement is telling, it can really help them break down and identify opportunities within their own business model. And if it's structured properly, as I've structured it here, it can really help be a quick diagnostic tool. So for example, if you'll allow me to walk through this real quick, I'll explain what I mean. This pretend company has 3 sources of revenue. In order to generate the revenue, I've also classified 3 COGS categories, meaning that there's 3 categories of direct labor and direct materials that are necessary to derive that revenue. And they are tied. So revenue 1 is tied to COGS 1, revenue 2 to COGS 2, so on and so forth. And what that allows us to do is when we have different activities within the business, when we structure our financials this way, we're quickly able to ascertain whether that specific revenue line is profitable or not. And as I've annotated here off to the side, that specific top portion is the product or the service model of the business. And I think it's important when you're looking at the business model, business planning, any of those types of activities, when you're trying to determine whether you have a marketable and profitable idea to take to market, is that you break down your financials this way so that you can quickly identify and understand, is this an activity that I should be participating in? Is it maybe something that needs a little bit more work on negotiating with the supplier side so that I can get my costs down? Are there labor in the production side that maybe can be handled differently? But when it's structured this way, you can quickly start to identify those areas where you can target and work on the business to help make sure that the products and services themselves are profitable before we move on to actually building a business model around the products and services. The bottom portion of the statement, that's where we actually get into building the business model. So when we start adding buildings, whether that's factories or canning facilities, or maybe washing and packaging and labeling facilities, if we're in the agribusiness, to building a restaurant, any of the overhead or business structures that are necessary in order to get the product or service to market, that's going to fall below the line of gross profit. And that's going to be included in our overhead. Once we've determined that our top line, our gross profit, so the product or service model is in fact profitable, then it's appropriate to move down and actually start to look at the business model that we're structuring around the product or service. And if we can keep both of those in the black, meaning both of those in the positive, what we're really working towards is more resilience within the product and service model and the business model itself. So, to recap the top portion of this, the top portion, your COGS, are your direct materials and direct labor. Subtracting that from your revenue will come down to the gross profit. If we have a positive number, then we have done a great job of identifying and sourcing our materials and our labor in order to get the product or service to market. One of the things I often hear, and with my background in the grocery industry, we often heard the term, well, we're just going to make it up with volume. It's okay to have a loss leader. We're going to make it up in volume. And the truth of that is not a resilient strategy. So if you're in that situation where you're hoping to make it based on volume, we really need to sit back and analyze what are the cost structures of your product and service, and how can we identify ways to bring that into a profitable realm without depending upon the volume to be there to make it up. We need to analyze the factors that make up those direct costs. And then we need to take steps to reduce those costs or cover those costs through efficient pricing strategy. Another way of stating that is, if there's just no way that you can bring the cost down anymore, then you're going to need to change your pricing to reflect the cost of the product or service that you're offering. And if that's higher than what the market is willing to bear, that should tell you something about the product or service model that you're bringing to market. The market is validating that you are not a profitable product or service in the marketplace. And making it up through volume is a quick way to find yourself frustrated and probably spending more money than you want to. So these are the steps within the first portion of the business and the business planning strategy to determine resilience within the business model. The second portion of this statement, which is the business model structure, is going to be made up of your indirect variable cost and your indirect fixed cost. So the variable cost and the fixed cost, what differentiates those is if you have a line item on your financial statement that is in fact affected by the volume of sales, meaning that as sales goes up or goes down, then those costs change respective to sales, that would be a variable cost. If the costs remain fixed regardless of what sales volume is, that would be classified as a fixed cost. One of the favorite exercises that I like to work my clients through is working through each of their cost centers on their financial statements and getting a true understanding of what costs are fixed and variable. And once we've done that, we can go through a couple of different exercises that help them kind of understand, for every unit of sales or every hour of operating, what is their true cost? And sometimes I find that exercise helps them get a better visual over the true nature of the business and how much the business is costing them to run on a per hour or on a per unit basis. If gross profit is positive, then we can move on to working around the business model, as we stated in the previous slide. If you're not profitable, we have to start making changes to either the cost structure or the pricing structure to make that number come up to positive. And once we've done that, then we can move forward with building the business model around the product or service. Now, what I find is that this financial statement is often one of the scariest that's for business owners to deal with. But it does happen to be my favorite financial statement. While the income statement is really good, and there are some inherent components into the income statement that can help us build resilience, what really drives the resilience factor of a business is our ability to convert assets and liabilities into revenue creation. What do I mean by that? Let's start by looking at what the balance sheet is. And if you'll humor me, I don't mean to insult anyone who is aware of this. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So the balance sheet comprises of three main sections that deal with the assets of the business. So this is the liquid and non-liquid resources that are owned by the business. It's often used to determine if the business is worth anything. For business valuation experts and others who might be a little more savvy, they understand that assets can be a great predictor of value. However, this is not usually the best place to determine the worth of the business. There's other areas within the financials that we would do where we would determine that. The next section is going to be your liabilities section. So this is where we're going to book any of our short-term or long-term debt that is owed by the business. This is often used to determine if the company is in financial jeopardy. We want to look at different liquid ratios to determine how leveraged the business is with its debt ratios in order to maintain its operations. The third section, the final section, is the equity section. And this is a really great section to learn a lot about management's philosophy of the business, and even more particularly, the resilience of the business. The equity section is going to tell us how much has the owner invested and or removed from the business. And it's also going to tell us, does the business owe shareholders? Now, oftentimes when we engage with clients, they have a very myopic outlook on the business and how the financials of the business work. And this is particularly true within our SME clients. The common perception of business finance is very linear. And so what we see is that they often are looking at, well, I have revenue that's generated, and then I have my costs. So you can kind of see how my arrows are pointing down. I generate some revenue. That comes down to the gross profit. Then I take out my overhead expenses, and whatever's left over in the net profit, it ends up leaving the business. And that's not true of all business owners, but I do find that it is true of a lot of business owners. And so what we find is this very linear mindset as to how business finance works. The problem with this is there's no circulation of revenue here. There's no circulation of assets or liabilities in order to create leverage or ultimately resilience within the business model. And oftentimes when we try to bring up the topic of the balance sheet and how the balance sheet should be used side by side with the P&L, oftentimes they don't want to hear it. And that's the purpose of my little cartoon here. So ultimately, if we're going to use the financials to build resilience into the business model, we need to understand that the financials of a business are no different than the circulatory or the respiratory systems of the human or any biological body. It is a very circular motion, and each system is dependent upon the other in order to maintain a healthy state of homeostasis. So when we put the financials side by side, what we can do is we can help business owners understand that revenues created are only one part of the equation. Yes, we are going to have to reduce those revenues by the cost because that's just a normal part of business. In order to generate revenue, there's going to be costs that are associated with that. But at the end of the day, once we've covered those costs, what happens to the money next is very telling about the resilience a business and the business leaders and the business owners expect from that business. If instead of the money leaving the company, it actually flows over into the balance sheet, what will happen is you'll see it come off of net profit, and it'll flow right up in here into our retained earnings. The retained earnings are a cumulative number over the life of the company, which will tell us how well the company has done since its beginning as far as pulling money over from the net profit side. So this is one area where we can look to see what is the revenue generation capacity once the costs have been considered of a specific company. Once the money is moved up into retained earnings, this is where we start to learn about where the habits of the business ownership and the leadership really feel they can gain leverage within the marketplace. The money should come up in a truly resilient business model. The money should come up and it should be used to acquire assets and or liabilities to further create more revenue. What does that mean? Well, in some instances, it might be new or better or more equipment. In some instances, it might be different packaging machinery. It might be more training in the aspect of on-site training services to help keep your employees more productive. There are a number of different categories within both the assets and the liabilities that can be acquired that are going to help complete the circulatory effect of revenue generation. The important thing to note here is if the company is saying, well, we're going to go buy an asset, and let's say I'm in the restaurant industry and I decide I'm going to go buy a nice ski boat. Chances of that ski boat making the revenue that I would need to cover the cost of the asset that's applicable to my business model is not probably the best use of the resource in the terms of assets that we're talking about. What we should be looking at is new or better kitchen equipment, new or better seating for the dining area. Maybe even looking at purchasing a building if I'm currently in a leased space. Those are the different types of investments that we want to look at making with the company or with those resources in order to help drive the financial resilience of the business itself. Okay, so now that we've got a better understanding of the financials and how to drive financial resiliency, now we want to start to look at how do we create resiliency through enhanced member participation. And the simplest answer for most of us is show them the money, right? Actually, I think it's different than the money. I think a lot of people want to believe that we're money motivated and money driven. But when it comes to being a consumer, I think there's something deeper that resides in all of us. And what we're actually looking for is value. And most importantly, maybe that's the expected value. If you've ever taken a marketing course, or I've heard some of the other BLP presentations talk about the expected value that from a marketing standpoint that your marketing messaging should be included and expressing out to the marketplace. And it's no different when we're talking about building resiliency through member participation. We have to remember that as business owners, sometimes it's easy for us to believe that we understand the value that our employees or our customers stand to gain by participating with our business. But it's also important to understand that it's not the job of the customer or the employee to see the value through our eyes as owners, but rather it's our job as owners to see the value that customers and employees expect to see from their perspective. And when we're able to do that, I think we're able to get more closely aligned with that enhancing member participation because we're meeting the needs and expectations of the value they expect to gain by participating with our business. So bringing the conversation back to the financial side, because there is a financial component that we have to acknowledge. It's not just about the good feelings of they've met my expectations. There's always going to be a financial component. This is an exchange of value, and in an exchange of value, there's going to be some type of monetary or value-based exchange. Within a resilient business, particularly within the co-op and the ESOP business structure, what that value is going to look like is both the short-term wealth creation capacity and the long-term wealth creation capacity. With co-ops and employee-owned structured businesses, the short term is typically going to be referred to as your patronage dividends, or based on how well the company is able to generate revenues and control costs, there will usually be a dividend declaration at the end of the year or some period based on whatever the board of directors decides. But for the most part, we'll call it annual. and that would be considered a short-term wealth creation capacity. In part one of the webinar series, we talked about oftentimes co-ops will issue up to an 8% dividend distribution based on the financial performance of the co-op throughout the year. And this again goes back to the same conversation where short-term wealth creation can be created on an annual basis by excess proceeds being returned back to both the employees and the consumers, depending upon how it's structured, in order to help incentivize and create that value. On the long-term basis, co-ops are amazing. They're amazing, probably in my opinion, this is in my humble opinion, probably more effective than most superannuation or 401k or 503b, whatever type of retirement investment program that is available on the market. And that is a bias-based opinion, because one of the things that I like within my retirement investment is the ability to control my investments. And participation with the companies, particularly as a co-op basis, I get to exercise my democratic voice as a voting member of the organization. The outstanding shares, every time there's a dividend distribution, the board of directors can elect to do either an immediate distribution or a delayed distribution, where the company is going to take some of that dividend that they've declared, they're going to reinvest it back in the co-op. Members will still be assigned their share base, and that grows their long-term wealth within the co-op. And over time, the more co-ops and the longer the participation is within that, the higher that wealth creation is, assuming that the company has done well financially and operationally, and that members are participating in growing the strength and the resilience of that co-op. So the short-term wealth creation is created through the cost and the pricing savings, just as we've discussed previously within the product and service model. That short-term wealth creation is created by leadership's and the business's ability to control those costs and set proper pricing strategies that ultimately translate into a healthy net profit. And then the short-term wealth creation is realized through patronage dividends. Long-term wealth creation is created through equity investment or development of the co-op. So all of the assets the co-op owns eventually trickle back down and are owned by the members of the co-op itself. And then expanding co-op membership to include more aspects of the household budget. Mondragon in Spain is probably one of the best examples we have in the world. That they're currently comprised of over 1,290 businesses, I believe, as of the last count. And I believe it was 870 plus businesses structured within the Mondragon co-op are co-op structured businesses themselves, and they comprise from everything from finance to healthcare to banking to postage to entertainment. They cover the entire gamut of industry. And this is an opportunity. Mondragon Spain is an opportunity for us to really see the power of cooperative-based structures as an ability to build resilient local economies for the members, for the people who are working, living, and playing within those communities. So how do we start a co-op from scratch? Well, just like any business, it's going to start with identifying a business idea. So someone or a group of people are going to sit around and say, hey, we've identified an opportunity in the market. Let's see if we can't build a business to fill that need. So the next step after they've identified that business idea is they're going to hopefully conduct a proper business or market feasibility analysis. And this will be an opportunity to truly understand what's happening within the market, what competing forces there will be, and what obstacles they might have to overcome in order to successfully deliver that product or service to market. If they determine that it is something that they should move forward on, at that point, it would be appropriate to assemble a steering committee or a launch board of directors. In the work that RBI does, this is often where we will come into play. If we are asked to conduct the market or the feasibility analysis, we will do so. And at what point we've determined that the business is something that we should move forward on, RBI will seat one of these positions on the board of directors to help guide the launch of the co-op itself. Throughout the process, RBI is training other board of director members, and we are also preparing for the initial board of directors, which will replace the initial or the launch board of directors within 90 days of the grand opening of the co-op itself. So the steering committee is just intended to get through all the administrative and the membership processes necessary to get the business off the ground. Once the business is off the ground, RBI and any other consultants who are making up that launch board of directors come off, and the voting membership of the co-op votes in their board of directors. Within the steering and the launch process, the articles of incorporation will be written. They will also write the bylaws, which will include a detailed conflict resolution policy. They will also develop the membership application. And then once that's done, it's time to get to work and start the membership drive. This usually encompasses a good marketing effort and everything that's necessary to get the word out that, hey, we're new, we're a co-op, we're here for you. And you start that membership drive to start generating membership. If the company or the co-op needs capital, this would be a necessary or appropriate place to start raising capital. There are a number of ways that capital can be raised for co-ops. One can be what's called a MISO, or a member investor service offering, and the legality of this will differ depending upon the country of origin. But it is possible to structure raising capital, raising equity from the membership, the initial membership itself. Oftentimes we find that most co-ops are not comfortable with this or don't feel that their initial membership will be in a financial capacity to do this, at which point we start to pursue other means or other areas through philanthropic or other social justice type investors to bring the necessary capital to get the project going. And then over time, the membership can buy that investment back. Once the capital is raised and the business is ready to move forward, the very next step that we want to do is get the accounting and the member equity management components in place. And the reason for this is we want the membership to feel comfortable and know that things are being appropriately accounted for and that they can trust in the transparency of the organization. And then the final step, as I stated, once the business is open, usually within 90 days of the grand opening, it's important to transition your launch board of directors off and in place your initial board of directors on. The bylaws and the articles of incorporation will specify the terms. It is my recommendation that you have a revolving board of directors that rotates about every 48 months. And that way you retain some of the existing knowledge and talent on the board of directors as you're replacing seats, or at least making the seats available for vote within the cooperative membership. And that way you don't get bogged down by long-term people who may not necessarily fully represent the voice of the co-op membership. If you're currently an operating business and you're thinking about transitioning to a co-op, one of the first questions you need to ask yourself is why? What is the reason that you're thinking about this? RBI has done a number of transitions where the owner has built the business but has had a very talented team of employees that have been with them from the start, or at least throughout the process of building the business. And when they've reached that transition stage, they feel that it's important to them to transition the company to the employees that have helped get them to that stage. And at which point there's an appropriate process for which the business would be evaluated. And then the existing owner would be offered a sum of money or some structure of equity and a cash buyout that would help recognize the risks that they have taken throughout their career of building the business, but represents a fair market value for the employees to purchase the business from the owner. So once the owner has that outline of why they want to transition, we can obtain the business valuation. Then it's probably an appropriate time to sit down and gauge employee interest in transitioning to ownership. If it's not employee ownership, there's always the option of going to consumer-based cooperative, but there's lengthy conversations that need to be taken around each of those different options and why you might consider one over the other. If the employees are interested, then the next step is going to be to revise the articles of incorporation to start structuring the entity as a co-op. We're going to transition or create a set of bylaws that will include that detailed conflict resolution policy, and that's going to help protect both the existing owner and the employees that are buying the company. We would elect a launch board of directors, just we do in a startup co-op. We would conduct the membership drive. Then we would raise the necessary capital, no different from if we were starting from scratch. We would modify any accounting practices and or member equity management practices that needed to be modified. and then we would launch or install the initial board of directors on the adopted bylaws once the transaction is complete. As we discussed in the previous slide, I wanted to talk about these components again. I felt there was some good questions that came out over what are some of the areas that we should focus on when we're looking at developing the leadership team. The financial acumen of the leadership team is always first and foremost for me. The reason that we participate in business is for monetary value. Even if there are non-monetary reasons for getting into the business still has a fiduciary responsibility to manage itself fiscally responsible. And so understanding what those fiduciary responsibilities as a leader, in my opinion, is crucial. And that is the duty of care. So what does it necessarily mean to make an informed decision? How much information is truly necessary before you make a decision about the direction of the company? The duty of loyalty, acting without personal economic conflicts, duty of good faith, advancing the interest of the corporation, duty of confidentiality, keeping corporate information confidential, and then duty of disclosure. Aside from financial training, the other area that I feel that is really necessary and important for leadership is the subject of execution and knowing what to execute on, how to monitor and manage the execution. So leaders must know how to execute on strategic goals and objectives. And I think if we can get back to our earlier lesson of understanding how money moves through the corporation, we can start to identify those areas that are really important from our product and service model. If there's areas that need work there, to our business model, if there's areas that we need work there, to looking at different assets and liabilities that can help complete that circulatory system of finance through the. Then it starts by knowing how to identify correct strategic goals and objectives to pursue, installing a culture of systematic problem solving and goal-oriented teams. We want to break bad habits. One of my best, I think, pain points when I'm into any business that I'm consulting with, I would usually spend at least the first hour, if not 2 hours, just walking around and observing what type of activity I see within the workplace. And generally speaking, most of the time what I see is activity that does not equal productivity. And thus I've adopted the belief that activity does not equal productivity. And it's important for us to train all the way throughout the organization to really question and assess and look at how do I spend my time and what is the most productive way for me to use this time. And then using a systematic approach like the 40X system from Franklin Covey, it's one of my favorites, the 4 disciplines of execution. I find that it really provides the necessary nuts and bolts to really identify appropriate strategic strategies for execution. And then there's always the emotional intelligence side, so compassion and accountability. So far with the leadership development, we've talked about the financial acumen, we've talked about the execution, and now we're talking about emotional intelligence. Leaders need to be trained in emotional intelligence. Leaders need to be reminded that they are not in charge of others, but they are there to take care of those in their charge. Leaders need to be trained in the practical application of concepts like, as I stated, leading is not about being in charge, but rather taking care of those in your charge. Accountability means putting systems in place where leaders can hold teams accountable, and probably more important, teams can hold leaders accountable. I'll leave it at that. That statement should hold itself. And leaders have to create a culture where it's acceptable to challenge their decisions. Oftentimes, I know it can be difficult to be in a position of authority, and oftentimes in that position, you're going to have more information than others, as it should be. But leaders should feel comfortable when someone chooses to challenge their decision, that they can defend that in a productive and healthy way and not get defensive or argumentative or turn it into a negative situation. The landscape of consumerism is changing, and COVID has even brought more of that to light. And I don't think any of us in the space really truly understand or able to grasp what the future of consumerism will look like. Within the US, for those who are watching, we know that Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg and many of the top tech CEOs are currently arguing against antitrust laws in the United States. We don't know what the future of this is going to look like, but we know that even within this space, there's conversations around how big is too big and how controlling is too controlling. So the landscape of consumerism is going to change, and hopefully it's going to change in a productive way where local economies find it possible to compete within their space. Increasing financial IQ in business leaders, employees, and consumers leads to more resilient economies. It's just one of those things. In order for true democratic voices to be heard and understood and to make intelligible conversation, the education needs to be there. Member participation improves when we directly address the expected value characteristics of the business. And investing in leadership development greatly improves the resilience of the business altogether. At this point, I'd be happy to take questions.
Wow, Kevin, thank you so much. It's such a very comprehensive presentation. I especially enjoyed I guess the metaphor that you were using to describe financial statements, that circulatory system that I think it explains it really, really well. We've got one question here from Linkus Consultancy in Vanuatu, who would just want to know the difference between the articles and bylaws of a business or company.
Wonderful. So articles of incorporation are usually be the legal document that's necessary to be filed with the monetary vision of government. So in every place it's different. Every requirement for articles of incorporation are different. But usually an articles of incorporation are going to identify the directors of the organization, the operating location or address. If there's a statutory agent assigned to the business, usually that would be like an attorney. So that's going to be primarily what, and also the shares. So if the organization is issuing any shares of stock, that will be contained within the articles of incorporation. The bylaws are kind of the rules of engagement. So the bylaws are a much more detailed, most of the articles of bylaws that I write for cooperatives we develop are somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 to 300 pages long. And it's the rules of engagement. So if this happens, this is what the result is. And it's provided for not only the leadership to follow and manage, but also for any members of the co-op to understand their roles and responsibilities and what responsibilities leadership and the co-op has to leadership itself. So does that answer the question?
Yes, I think so. So just when we're coming back to cooperatives, can you talk us a little bit through how you can generate revenue as a cooperative?
Absolutely. Co-ops, really, they operate just like any other conventional business. It's going to start with your product or your service, whatever that may be. And maybe, if you will, let me use the resort industry as an example. So a co-op could be a resort where the employees of the resort and some of the customers who would frequently visit the resort could be owners of the resort through co-op. But another opportunity exists in places like Fiji or in Vanuatu or the Solomon or the Cook Islands, places where it's kind of a confined or isolated industry, where all of the resorts could come together and they would generate revenue just as any resort, independent or non-cooperatively structured, would do, through accommodation, through food and restaurant, through activity-based and tourism-based. All of those normal revenue lines would still be available to the co-op. The difference being that now you have an industry structure where each of the resorts in the co-op are using their resources, as I stated in the first part of the presentation, to grow the slice of the pie that's available to them to pull from.
Kevin, I think we might have lost you. Are you still
Sorry,
there?
I still have you. Are you there?
Yes, I think we lost you for a little bit. Sorry, would you just repeat that last little bit you were saying?
Okay, so that when it comes to co-ops, they're going to generate revenue just as any other business would. Do I still have you?
You have us now. You left for a little bit there. It might be just we
Sorry.
might be having some connectivity issues.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully you heard the part where co-ops generate revenue just as any other business would.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. We got that, but that's the important part. Yes. Okay. So just quickly, if anyone else has any more questions for Kevin, please do type them in the chat box for us. Anything that you have in mind about what he's presented. I'm assuming that most people have probably seen part one as well, and if not, that's available on our website, and this webinar will be available on the website as well. Kevin, while we're waiting for some more questions, do you perhaps want to tell us a little bit about the type of business advisory services that you can offer to SMEs in the Pacific Islands now that you're part of the Business Link Pacific network?
Yes. So one of the primary services that we'll offer will be cooperative development and or employee ownership and transition for those existing businesses who may be looking for transition and aren't quite sure about the direction that they want to go, or maybe they do want to transition to employees and are looking for assistance in making that transition. Other areas of assistance that we can offer are within the market analysis section, so helping them understand what their market is and how to gain access to their market, and even moving forward into operational aspects of the business. So our primary focus within that space is going to be looking at how the company operates and identifying ways that we can help fine-tune operations to drive more profit into the business. And then we provide consulting services on the balance sheet, as we mentioned, to look at different assets and liabilities that can help complete that circulatory system and generate more revenue for the business.
Fantastic. So for those of you interested in connecting with Kevin and RBI through the BLP network, you can visit our website, our BLP portal, businesslinkpacific.com, and find Kevin in the advisor database there. And Kevin, I understand you're still in the States, not in Vanuatu yet?
Not yet. We are monitoring closely and hoping and anxious for when Vanuatu will open. We respect and understand the need to keep the Vanuatu and the citizens of Vanuatu safe from COVID. So, but we do look forward to when the border opens and we can get over and start doing business and helping businesses there in the Pacific.
Yeah, we're very excited about having you as part of the network. So yes, all the best with traveling over, hopefully in the near future. So if there are no more other questions for Kevin today, we'll start wrapping up our webinar. Kevin, thank you again so much for joining us. Both part one and part two of this Resilience Through Cooperation webinar, they're going to make invaluable teaching resources for SMEs in our network. So thank you so much for taking the time to prepare and present for us twice. Really appreciate it. We'll make sure that we have a copy of Kevin's presentation on our website, as well as the recording of today's webinar, in case there's anyone you know that might want to watch and maybe take some notes from these great presentation slides. Next week's webinar will be presented by Belinda Bota. She's the owner-operator of Dive Munda Consulting in the Solomon Islands. Belinda she's doing a part two as well. She presented a brilliant webinar a few weeks ago on navigating the COVID-19 storm, which you can also find on our website. And so she'll be presenting part two of that next week. And we'll be sending out the invite for her webinar tomorrow. Thank you again so much, Kevin, and thank you everyone for joining us today. See you again, same time, same place next week. Ngā mihi.